Hello, everybody. It's Wild Man Z here with a book update. I've completed a chunk of my library tour. Everything else is in boxes all over the place. Maybe I'll pull them out over time. A lot of books I haven't looked at in a long time. So I'm going to focus on some things that I'm reading now. Right now, I was going to call it Middlemarch in March, or Middlemarch Madness, but I started reading in February. What the hell? One of my goals this year was to read more books written by female authors and books written by female or male authors that had strong female characters. So I got one here that's both. This is Middlemarch, written by George Eliot. George Eliot, of course, was a woman. That was Mary Ann Evans. She wrote this in the early 1870s, but it's set in the time of her childhood. She was born around 1820, and this is set from roughly 1829 to about 1831, 1832, and there. And it's a big old book. It's about 800 pages. I read about half of it in the last week and a half, and I'm not a really fast reader because of the fact that I do a lot of side research. As I'm reading this book, some of the things that I've been doing research in the form of watching videos and reading Wikipedia pages, nothing really intensive, is it takes a little back knowledge about the Reform Acts that occurred. So we're at the time of the story. It's the Industrial Revolution is relatively new in England. And at the time, basically the way the government was set up was that landowners, people that didn't necessarily have tons of money but had a lot of property, controlled Parliament. And there was a limited number of people who could vote. Something like 1 out of 12 men could vote, and women couldn't vote at all. Around 1831, 1832, there was surmounting tension involving the idea of basically the new money, which was industrialists wanting to basically exude their voice in Parliament. And so in 1832, there was a Reform Act that allowed rich factory owners and so forth and other people to become members of Parliament. And it also increased the number of people that could vote to roughly 1 in 6, which was a big deal. It basically doubled. But again, really poor people and women, servants, things like that, they didn't count. And so the writing in here involves a lot of those type of themes. But instead of focusing on London or even focusing on the burgeoning industrial cities like Manchester, it focuses on the provincial region of Middlemarch, which is not a real area, but I would take it from reading online, that it was probably the area for childhood, which is Coventry, England, which is, I think, in the Western Highlands region of England. So it's a rural region, and just like with Jane Austen, the focus is on characters that are usually upper class people, or definitely upper middle class and up, genteel people, people with good educations, often landed gentlemen and so forth. Not aristocracy per se, but better off people. So the servants and the tenant farmers and the laborers they're just mentioned by name, or the guy over there carrying the wood. They're not really, their story is not told. And this is very typical of the time in the Victorian era. It just was not considered worthy of a story to tell the story of the poor people. On the other hand, the characters they do focus on, it's very exquisite writing and very exquisite storytelling. I guess the character on the cover, which is from a painting, and I'm not sure what it is, represents Dorothea Brooks, who's one of the main characters. She's a young woman, I would say 20-ish, who's beautiful. She grows up with a very puritanical mindset. She's an orphan, but she lives with her sister Celia, with her uncle Mr. Brooks, who's a fairly well-off man. He's a magistrate. He has land and so forth. He goes, he's in politics. And he's a nice fellow, but he raises these daughters very well. But her mindset is very much on always doing the proper thing, being very moral. And her worldview, she wants a capacious worldview, but her worldview is definitely formed by her little rural area she grew up in. She longs to read Latin and read Homer and Virgil and things like that. And that's just not for women at the time. Women, as George Eliot definitely teases out in this story, education for them included light reading. Maybe if you learned a little Latin or Greek, it was simply to read to a man who could understand those stories. You might just know the words. Embroidery, proper way to get off a horse, or on a horse, all knowing about dining sets and fabrics and things like that was considered a proper woman's education. and she really kind of longs for more. There's some good-looking younger men who like her, including a guy by the name of Sir James, who's a local baronet, a well-off landed man, good-looking. He has nice riding clothes and things like that. And he comes by the house all the time. That back in the day, the way that you met a woman was a woman of class was you went over the house and courted her by having dinner with the family and so forth. He comes over all the time, but he's sort of a one-dimensional guy. I mean, he's a nice person. He's has an education, but he doesn't think about lofty things that she does, or she wants to think of at least. She falls for a local clergyman who's well off. I think he has hereditary money, but he's an older guy. He's like my age, and he's in his 50s, and he's bald, and he has Sir James always kids. He has skinny bird-like legs type of thing. He's an old, weaker man. He's a scholar, though. He's always doing research in philosophy and particularly mythology. I really, when I read this, sometimes with people like, his name is Casselbaum, Mr. Casselbaum, I wonder like how this guy actually makes money. I take it most of it's inheritance. He gets some sort of a stipend or something from the government because he doesn't actually appear to work. But he appears to have money, and he has servants that he must take care of. And inheritance was a huge thing here. I'd say much more so than today. People vied for that inheritance and that land. To the end of the earth. And so Casselbaum has some family estate, he has some money, but he's 30 years older than this girl. But she's enamored by him because he speaks Greek and Latin. He's read all the books, the classics of antiquity and so forth. He speaks Latin, he speaks Greek. And he comes over the house, and she becomes enchanted with him. It's kind of obvious that they're growing together, although there's really nothing romantic between them that in any sense that I would think of romantic. I don't think there's any description of them ever kissing or holding hands or anything like that. But she longs for the idea of having this older man to be there for. Her role she imagines, is going to be to help him blossom and grow and continue his studies. His eyes are getting a little weak. She's going to read to him. She'll learn Latin and Greek in detail so she can read it to him, and then also enrich herself by understanding Homer and Virgil and these type of people. And other scholarly works. This guy like St. Thomas Aquinas, guys like that. She wants to learn all about that. Well, they get married, and it's not what she thinks. He's basically getting married because it's like he's an older guy. He's kind of like, it's a thing to do, and I kind of need a secretary. We learn that his big key masterwork, which is something called the Key to Mythologies, is basically a scatterbrained bunch of notes he has. This guy, he kind of reminds me of myself to an extent. He's got all the trappings of a great education, but he has a hard time pulling it together. You know what I mean? And he kind of writes. He's written a few pamphlets and things like that, but really his peers don't look up to him that much. And it's a lot. And he realizes that his life is kind of pretensive, and he realizes that he's way too old for this girl, and that he really can't. He's not able to relate with her at all. And he kind of finds that her wanting to go in the library and read to him is actually kind of slowing him down. And it also is revealing the fact that he's not moving along with this great masterwork of his, which I would take it would be something like Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces type of thing, but it's malformed, it's inchoate. And there's a lot of other great characters in here. The other big character in the first half of the book, I'm only about 400 pages in, is Dr. Lydgate. And what I had to get into reading a little bit off on the side about was there was different tiers of being a doctor back then. Now we have cardiologists and these guys today, but you respect the medical doctor. They're all different types, foot doctor, whatever. Back in those days, it was kind of like the two big classes were like the surgeon or the country practitioner doctor. He could dress a wound, he could put a leech on you, he could maybe pull a tooth, do some minor procedures like that. He was generally like an apprentice type of guy. He had a basic education, but then did an apprenticeship and became like a country practitioner, doctor, or surgeon. He was not as respected as, and this is the case of Tertius Lydgate. He is actually a practitioner. The guys who were respected because they had the Cambridge or Oxford educations were the physicians. They were actual MD type of guys who had like equivalent to like a PhD back then. They were academics, but like a lot of PhD guys, they were pretty much They didn't like to deal with people too much. They basically gave advisement. They taught courses at Oxford or Cambridge, and once in a while you might call upon them for their expert opinion or something like that. But they rarely actually got in the mix. They didn't. They're not going to go out there and just start stitching somebody up unless it's a really rich person and they feel obligated to. But they definitely, like, they're not going around checking on the common folk and things like that. And there's a kind of a class distinction between these two guys. And so Tertius Lydgate actually comes from a ritzy family, but for some reason they thought it would be good for him to just get a practical country apprenticeship and be like a hard-working country doctor as opposed to going to a real medical school. So he's kind of like another character, has, like, a little bit of consciousness about his social position and things like that. And he kind of moves out. He's not from Middlemarch. He moves there, and he kind of goes there from the city to, he says early on, because he doesn't feel he'll be around challenging people, so he can focus on his research. Like, he does a lot of things with, like, galvanic experiments with animals, which would involve probably studying the nervous system with electricity. This is before Maxwell and Faraday mapped out electromagnetic theory totally when this was written. After when the story occurs, when she wrote this, this was in the heyday of electromagnetism. But he's doing crude experiments with electric shocks to animals and things like that. Anatomy, physiology type stuff, and he wants to kind of focus on that while helping some people out, but not have to worry about all the trappings of dealing with other people who are lofty. He wants to go out and stick so he can focus. But what happens is Lucius Turgate, Dr. Lydgate, falls in love with a young lady who's the mayor's daughter, Rosamond, what's her last name, Vincy, and she's kind of like the town beauty queen type of thing, and she kind of presents that kind of an image. She's a beautiful young woman. Everybody's courting her. She's got all the ladylike stuff down, as opposed to Dorothea Brooks. They're kind of opposites. They're both beautiful, but Dorothea Brooks is sort of wants to be an academic. Rosamond just wants to be like the ideal, beautiful woman with good manners and things like that, who's presentable. And Tertius Lydgate falls in love with her. What's going to happen with that, I don't know. We're kind of in the early stages of their marriage. We meet a lot of other interesting characters in there. There's a classic funeral scene with a rich old guy who stiffs his family, and it's really kind of funny. She has a lot of comedy in there. The writing is elegant. She's both good with writing tongue-in-cheek type of stuff. She's very good with digressions, George Eliot, and going into aspects of history and philosophy, religion, and her opinion looking back 40 years later. Sometimes she digresses and says, this is, from the vantage point of now, this is how this looks. Like, she tells you she's writing this about the past. It's sort of metafictional extent in places in that sort of when she does that, it kind of throws you a little off. But she's an elegant writer. It's like constantly having me go look words up. She uses a lot of very great vocabulary, a lot of references to British culture and history that I had to look up. I did not know who Sir Peel was, or the Corn Laws, or all the details about, again, the Reform Acts and things like that. So there's a lot of things I have to look up. And also what I like about it is a lot of references to the Greeks and the Romans and antiquity in here. You can tell that George Eliot was an exquisitely well-read woman, excuse me. And I want to read more by her. This is the first time I've read this book and the first thing I've ever read by her. It's markedly different than Jane Austen, which was the other female writer I'm familiar with in that time period, and the Brontes. It's very different than anything I've ever read by them. Really glad I'm reading it. It's quite unexpected. I'm really wrapped up in these the character studies that are going on in here and the way it's weaving together. And I can see that they start off kind of separate. They have maybe some physical relations, but the storylines are definitely separate. Now she's starting to hone everything in together. We're starting to see the interplay of all these storylines. So I'm curious by page 800 how she basically wraps this thing up. So that's what I'm reading for the next week or two. And so maybe when I'm done, I'll make another video on it. So far, so good. I really enjoy it. I'm glad I'm reading it. Like I said, this year I want to focus on female authors, stories with strong female protagonists, and read a host of other classics. Not too much. I'm not going to read too many new books this year. Really, my reading of newer stuff last year really didn't pan out that well. Especially with the sci-fi and fantasy, it really struck me as quite lackluster. So I'm going to embrace the classics this year. And so right now it's Middlemarch, although it's not the middle of March yet. So on that note, Wild Man Z out. Thank you. Good day.